Hi everyone, today we're going to be making enemies from scratch. I am a little bit sick though, so forgive me for the sniffles. So to get started, let's go ahead and go over what an enemy really is. Enemies are something almost any game has, whether that be a simple AI for a fighting game, bots in a shooter game, or other racers in a racing game. Some games have more complicated or unique enemies, however, such as specialist zombies in the Left 4 Dead series or headcrabs in Half-Life. Games like Dreams, however, the enemy in create mode is yourself, or rather coming up with ideas on what enemies to put in your game and how to make them. I'm not sure about you, but when I play Dreams, I don't really see many enemies in the Dreams people. When I do see enemies in Dreams, they are usually simple puppets with not much thought or effort put into them. There are the rare gems, though, that do have a unique experience with stuff that fights back with more than a simple punch. But in this stage of the Dreams community's development, there isn't really much out there. In this video, I hope to teach you all how to make anything into an enemy. First off, what do I mean by anything? Well, most Dreams with enemies in them tend to use puppets for their enemies when this isn't at all required. Any sculpt can be made to fight back. Most people probably use puppets because they believe it's easier than making something from scratch. That may be the case if you want something humanoid to fight you, but that is pretty boring. A lot of people believe that making AI for your enemies is also pretty difficult, when in reality it isn't. To start, let's make a very simple enemy. Find any inanimate object in the Dreamiverse and bring it in. Imagine yourself as a cartoonist, or as if you were playing something like Cuphead, where common objects come alive. Once you have an idea of what that object would look like when animated, go ahead and add any fine details you need, such as eyes, some limbs, or maybe even a mouth. Once the model is settled, the next thing you want to do is set up how the player will interact with the enemy. When I say interact, I mean how will the player or enemy interact when touching each other. Is there collision between the player and the enemy? Will the enemy hurt the player simply from touching them? How will the enemy take damage, etc.? For a simple case, let's say the player can collide with the enemy, but will only take damage if the enemy attacks them. Depending on the object, you may need to make a collision shape that is simple enough to give the object space enough to attack. If you need this, go ahead and group the shape with the model, then scope in and make the shape not visible. We also want to know how the player will damage the enemy. Depending on what you already have, you may want to be able to jump on the head of the enemy, or simply take damage when the player attacks. The answer to this is simple, a health manager, but we need a place to place it first. I'd recommend placing a microchip on the front face of the enemy, or you could group it with the enemy at their feet, like a puppet. But make sure to use the affected object output on the chip to make sure that you are affecting the entire group rather than the model in the group itself. Once you have your health manager, it should work with most attacks or weapons found in the Dreamiverse. If you want your enemy to take damage from being jumped on, you will need logic for that specifically. You can do this by making sure you label your enemy and players properly first, then using a collision sensor, trigger zone, and health modifier. You can set this up using the labels to make sure only the player touching it works. Then, you may want to add a force applier for an extra jump effect. Now that we have something that can properly take damage, let's get it to actually interact with the world and the player. One thing in particular people believe is difficult in this aspect is the AI. How do I make it not collide with walls, find the player, attack them only when close, etc.? The answer is, you fake it. If you want the enemy to roam around, just make an invisible cube, then animate it to move around at random. Then using a follower, have your enemy follow the cube. You can also use the speed sensor to activate a movement animation on a timeline to make it look as if it were actually moving in the ground, rather than just sliding. As an extra tip, you can also turn off the strength of the follower in the Y direction, so it cannot even leave the ground, technically. Now, for attacking the player, you ideally want to make an animation for it. To start, the best method is actually layering with an action recorder. What you do is grab the part of the object you want to record first, or if you have connectors on your object, you most likely want to record the root object. Then, you restart time and edit the action recorder. This will not delete the other animation data stored on it, so you can add actions to the enemy. This is how I did the animation for my candy cane enemy, actually. The best part about this is if you are not satisfied with the animation because it's too shaky or there are parts of it that look wrong, you can place the action recorder on a timeline and place keyframes at parts of the animation, record the placement of the models, and then, of course, set the blend to linear, delete the action recorder, and you have a much smoother animation. Once the animation side is finished, it's really easy to trigger damage from it. You can use a timeline to trigger logic too, not just keyframes. You can simply add a health modifier to the timeline and set up the labels correctly, and then place the zone area to the place of impact, and bam, you have a functioning attack. Next, you may ask yourself, how do I get it to attack the player specifically though? Well, it's pretty easy. Simply place a trigger zone set to detect the player, then make a new follower set to follow the player. If you need it to face the player, go ahead and place a lookout rotator too. Power on the follower and rotator with the trigger zone, and use a NOT gate to turn off the follower for the roaming tag cube. It also helps to use the follower's inner radius on the second page to make it so they only get so close to the player so they don't just run them over, unless this is the behavior you want. You can use a smaller radius trigger zone to activate the attack animation, and there you go. A simple enemy from scratch. If you add in a few of these kind of enemies, it will help your game stand out, as you don't have the standard puppet, and the unique shapes and sizes of an enemy can help catch the eyes of players browsing the Dreamweaverse. This methodology can be extended out to include other forms of enemies, such as flying enemies, enemies that shoot you, and more. In a dream I'm currently working on, I have a couple of enemies that are made with this ideology. One is a flying orb that lightning strikes you, and the other is a flying police cruiser. They may not seem like much, but they are special in the way that they are presented. I'd also like to announce another creation contest. This time, the winner gets their enemy used in my latest project, the Memes the Game expansion. I will also, of course, feature all the creations in a showcase video on the channel. There are no real rules to this, but there is some important information to disclose. The project theme is mainly sci-fi with bits of fantasy and horror. The game is comedic, obviously, but the expansion is a bit more serious than the rest of the game. The player has the labels friend and target, so damage modifiers should be set to damage anything with both of those labels, not just either or, the all option. The enemy should have the labels foe and target, as the player damages things with those two tags only. You can also turn off the target tag for invincibility as an ability if you'd like. Thank you all for watching this video. Make sure to leave a like and comment. Also, subscribe if you haven't already. There's quite a few people that watch my content on my channel that aren't subscribed. Also, I have a Patreon if you weren't aware of that. This video is going out a day early on there. And I'd also like to take this time to thank my patrons: Christian Sanchez, Derry Skolason, Dylan Woodbury, Empty Chest, Mythic Marty, Patrick Keller, William Snyder. Once again, thank you all for watching, and have a great day. Bye-bye.